This documentary is brought to you by History 102 Corporations, making documentaries since 2 weeks ago. This film was funded by the Galaty Foundation, making history accessible to all. Also brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you.
War. It overthrows governments, fosters new technologies, brings ruin and death, creates new empires, establishes power struggles, revives economics, forms new religions, destroys lives, makes history. War creates, destroys, changes the world. This is warfare of Western civilization.
Beginning in 1337, the English and French started a 116-year-long conflict for control over France. The war was initially sparked by Philip VI, who declared that Edward III's territories in France would be taken away from him because the English king had been foolish to not turn over Philip's mortal enemy, Robert of Artois. England held a large part of France and was uninclined to give up the lands that gave them a powerhold over the French. In 1340, the war escalated with the Declaration of Ghent, in which Edward proclaimed himself to be rightful heir to the throne because of close relations from his mother to the prior French king. But the French had never allowed for kingship to descend through the female line. From this, there sprouted 3 separate wars: the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, and the Lancastrian War. It brought about the end of feudalism, a dominant social system which distanced the king from his subjects by putting lords and nobles who traded military support for lands between the peasants and the king. Because the need for armies was so great, the king began to use foot troops in battle rather than cavalry, which had been used for centuries. Not since the Holy Roman Empire had there been this large number of standing armies. These troops consisted mostly of commoners. No longer were peasants a secondary group that had to be protected. The peasants were now a much-needed resource for the king's armies and held a higher value. Within the war, the English had begun victorious, defeating the French in multiple battles and capturing lands across the countryside of northern France due to the English longbow. At 6 feet long and with over a 300-yard range, the longbow was able to pierce most types of armor. The French fell to the longbow's power. The war seemed to be in favor of the English over the decades, that is, until the tides turned with 2 very important events. First, the siege of Orleans was lifted, thanks to the forces led by a young woman with visions of God, Joan of Arc. Joan led the French to victory, driving the English out as God had shown her, and revived French nationalism and raised the morale of the troops. And second, King Charles VII made Jean Brew Master of Artillery in 1439, and by doing so turned the war around. Brew built up an effective siege train of artillery that was used to recapture the towns and cities taken by English early in the war. By 1450, the French no longer needed to go into battle. The English would surrender as soon as the artillery train was deployed. With these major victories, France regained its pride. Multiple losses on the English side followed, and finally the conflict was at end. Although there was no peace treaty to end the war, the English recognized that the French troops were too strong to be confronted. Ultimately, the English lost their hold over all of their lands in France and were forced back to their island country. They saw a rise in power in Parliament, who had gained influence when it was needed to raise armies, whereas France experienced a new power from the king, who had won the nobles' support with his wars on the English, creating a new Europe.
The War of the Eight Saints was a short war, only lasting 3 years. It began in 1375 and ended in the summer of 1378. The war was focused on politics more than military battles and brought a whole new way of fighting a war, one of diplomacy rather than military tactics. It all began during the early 1370s with rising Florentine fear of the Papal State's true intentions. The Florentines had many reasons to believe that the Pope was plotting to attack Florence. Although Florentines were afraid, the Papal State was at war with Milan at the time, causing Florentines to be in fear of attack that might not come for years. It was all a matter of waiting until the papacy was finished with Milan. Florence was led to believe that Pope Gregory XI was planning on invading Florence because of rising suspicion that he was planning to recover once papal-owned lands, and even more than what the Church had originally owned. One instance of hostility between Florence and the Church was when the Pope stated that the papacy needed help from the Florentines to defeat the Visconti in Milan, but Florence refused to aid the Church. Another moment between the two states of current-day Italy and France that created tension between the two occurred when the ruler of Perugia denied food to Florence, causing many people of Florence to believe that it was a plot created by the Pope to starve the people of Florence. In an attempt to decrease the chances of an invasion from the Papal State, the Florentine government decided to form a non-aggression pact with John Hawkwood, the commander of the Papal State military. This would cost Florence 130,000 florins. In order for Florence to be able to pay for this, a council of 8 men was created, titled Auto dei Preti. The council was in charge of taxation and the clergy to ensure that Florence could pay for the non-aggression pact. Another committee of 8 men was created later on during the war. This committee was known as Auto della Guerra and was in charge of diplomatic and military decisions during the war. The creation of the two 8-man committees was what gave the War of the Eight Saints its name. In an attempt to gain support from the people of the Papal State, Florentine agents were sent into the cities to start revolts and rebellions against the Pope. In reaction to this, Pope Gregory used his power to place an interdict on Florence, causing all religious practices in Florence illegal, legalized the arrest and enslavement of all Florentine people, and also legalized the seizure of Florentine property, including property owned by citizens of Florence all over Europe. The Florentine government refused to follow these laws and forced religious practices to continue, resulting in a large amount of fines and a debt to the church to pay off. Gregory XI died in March of 1378, causing the war to come closer to an end. Urban VI became the pope shortly after the death of Gregory XI. In July of 1378, a peace treaty between the papacy and Florence was signed at Tivoli. The treaty included that Florence was to pay the church 200,000 florins, restore and return all papal property, and repeat all laws against the church. In return, the church was to repeal the interdict placed on Florence. The War of the Eight Saints was fought with a new style of war that was almost completely fought through politics. The diplomacy of the war and the usage of diplomatic power was not a common way of fighting a war at the time, and the War of the Eight Saints created a new way of fighting a war.
The next series of wars started right after the 100 Years' War due to social and financial troubles brought by the weak rule of King Henry VI. The Wars of the Roses, dating between the years of 1455 and 1487, is the name that was given to the dynastic struggles between two influential rival houses, both vying for the English throne. The two families within this struggle was the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The House of Lancaster's badge was the red rose and the House of York's was the white rose, thus naming these battles the Wars of the Roses. The largest battle fought was the Battle of Towton. It was the one-day battle in March 1461 and is also known as the Battle of Bloody Snow. Due to this being a local war, there were able to be more men present for the fighting. A force sent to France during the 100 Years' War might have numbered only 5,000 men, perhaps 10,000 at the most, whereas the numbers present at Towton were at least 50,000. Transporting Englishmen across the Channel to fight a foreign war did not apply to civil war, where men were needed only for a month or so, and served usually within a week's march or two of their homes. The winner of this battle was the York's men, who ended up causing the Lancaster troops to retreat. However, it became a slaughter and over 12,000 Lancaster men were killed while retreating. Most of the major battles only lasted a day, and it was still in the style to meet on an open field and fight with little strategy. Most of the bodies found at the battle sites, such as Towton, show that the majority were killed with longbow. Most of the peasant men that were fighting on foot were the first in line of attack, while the Duke's trained cavalry stayed back waiting to fight upon their horses. The Battle of Bosworth was the turning point in the wars. It removed the last York king from the throne and helped to put one of the most famous European royal families into power, the Tudor family. As this brought the Wars of the Roses to an end, it created its own challenges for the family. They would have to take on creating a new life for England and its people. King Henry VII's first action was to marry Elizabeth of York, thus securing the support of both Lancaster and York houses. He made it illegal and unlawful for the barons to create their own armies. Rather, unified one army in the name of England. This was to hopefully stop any further civil wars. Economically, King Henry VII was considered a frugal man, thus helping to strengthen the English economy. King Henry VII ruled for 26 years. He then died and peacefully passed the throne to his son, King Henry VIII. The Tudor dynasty ruled for a total of 118 years.
The 16th century brought changes to the way wars were fought in the Western world. For centuries, war tactics revolved around the use of feudal knights, foot soldiers, and archers. Pre-battle planning was essential for the success of the armies. Many war leaders during the time consulted old texts regarding warfare, such as De Re Militari, written by Vegetius in the late 4th century. Because many battles were fueled by the desire to seize wealth and valuables from different kingdoms, fortifications and castles were built for protection against besieging armies. It wasn't until gunpowder was brought into the mix that these fortifications and means of defense became less powerful. Although many armies across Europe and the Western world in the 16th century adapted to the introduction of weapons, such as the mobile cannon, muskets, and arquebusiers, the Spanish army was the most threatening of the time. With the Italian wars, the Spanish army began to form new tactics involving firearms, such as the pike and shot formation. During these wars, Spanish generals realized that their cavalry was insufficient compared to the heavy cavalry of the French. Therefore, they created the pike and shot formation, in which pikemen provided defense from enemy cavalry, while arquebusiers concentrated their firepower on enemy formations. This tactic gave countries the ability to expand their armies and spread wars across further boundaries. One major battle that glorified the Spanish army's military advancement was the Battle of Pavia. The battle took place in Italy on February 24, 1525, and was fought between the French kingdom and Spain. Spanish forces created a breach in the city walls where 3,000 arquebusiers advanced on the French headquarters. As the battle progressed, the French lost morale. After only 3 hours of battle, French soldiers began to flee, and the French king was captured and escorted away from the battle. This loss for the Kingdom of France was devastating, as their forces were weakened while the Spanish gained their land and power. Throughout all the battles and wars fought during the 16th century, there is one element of warfare in common: the use of firearms. Wars were soon able to be fought across larger boundaries, and the casualties of war increased by the hundreds of thousands. Power struggles continued to surge throughout the Western world as technology increased, and soon after were major turning points in the history of the world.
Good afternoon and welcome. The topic for today, the 30 Years' War. The war began in 1618 and lasted until 1648, and involved all the major European powers at the time. With significant advances in military strategy and technology, the war evolved into a beast that seemingly could not be tamed. Let's start by taking a look at the outbreak of the war in present-day Austria, under the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. By the 17th century, the Protestant Reformation had deep roots in Martin Luther's native Germany, which was the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. At the time, the emperor had to be appointed by the Pope, and he was Ferdinand II from the House of Habsburg. The authority of the Catholic Church had come under threat, and Ferdinand II made a desperate attempt to regain control of the empire by violently suppressing the Protestants. In Western Europe, war raged on between Spain, the Dutch Republic, and France. The rulers of Spain were also a part of the House of Habsburg, and the Dutch had been fighting them for their independence since 1568. France officially entered the scene in 1635 and helped foster the peace process to bring an end to the all-consuming war. The Peace of Westphalia was signed on October 24th, 1648, and recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic and gave rise to France and the House of Bourbon as the most powerful monarchy in Europe. The House of Habsburg and the Catholic Church had seen their day and lost their influence and superiority. This major change in power dynamics came at a high price in civilian casualties. It is estimated that 8 million people died, and huge populations of peasants had been decimated throughout Europe. Next up, a continuation of the 17th century with Sophia Khan. Thanks for joining me. Have a good evening.
The 30 Years' War was fought throughout Europe for dynastic, territorial, religious, and commercial reasons. The Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648 and marked the end of the 30 Years' War. The peace was negotiated in Munster and Osnabrück in the Westphalia region of what is now Germany. The Spanish-Dutch Treaty was signed on January 30th, 1648. On October 24th, 1648, it was signed by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III, other German princes, France, and Sweden. This treaty is attributed with the importance and dignity of establishing world unity on the basis of states exercising sovereignty over certain territories. It began a practice of calling a general congress to conclude wars. While the map as outlined in the treaties is no longer, the chief political idea of the Franco-German settlement has undergone relatively little change. This treaty also emphasized religious equality between Catholics and Protestants. Religious equality was also placed as part of the peace as an international guarantee. However, fighting continued between France and Spain for 10 more years. The Peace of the Pyrenees marked the end of the Franco-Spanish War. It was signed in 1659, and the negotiated terms had a broad, lasting impact. Roussillon and Artois were ceded to France, and France also acquired Alsace and Lorraine. French conquests in Catalonia were restored to Spain, and the treaty also involved a marriage between Louis XIV and the Spanish infant Maria Theresa. Although the Spanish infant was to give up her rights to the Spanish crown and Spanish possessions in return for a dowry, the French knew the Spanish would not be able to pay. Even if the dowry had been paid, it was questionable in French and Spanish law if a princess could renounce both her and her unborn child's God-given rights. Louis XIV exploited the ambiguities of this arrangement to his benefit. He used the betrothal to get a hold of the Spanish Netherlands, and 40 years later, to gain the Spanish crown for his grandson, Philip. This established Louis XIV as a powerful monarch and marked the demise of the Spanish monarchy.
The 1700s in many ways is when war became what it is today. Warfare in this time period began to take the large scale found on today's battlegrounds, and its motives became more relatable to the modern view. The start of the industrialization of war began in this time period, and it was this time period where the first examples of modern total war could be found. Wars such as the 7 Years' War had a scale that would have astounded those who lived a mere 2 centuries before, as warfare spread across the globe for the first time. Battles on the other side of the globe could have a strong impact on the nations involved and their allies. This, of course, is not the first time European powers had fought wars in distant lands, but this was the first time the wars were not separate and distinct entities, but rather parts of a more global power struggle. The nature of war in this time period wasn't the only thing that changed. The methods of war became more diverse as Europeans began to adopt the guerrilla-style combat of the natives they often faced, alongside the more traditional clash of armies. Cases of this new style of warfare for Europeans were prevalent in the French and Indian Revolutionary Wars. One British soldier who faced colonial guerrillas described his encounter as follows. On our leaving Concord to return to Boston, they began to fire at us from behind walls, ditches, trees, etc., which, as we marched, increased in a very good degree, and continued without intermission of 5 minutes altogether, for I believe upwards of 18 miles, so that I can't think, but it must have been a preconcerted scheme in them to attack the King's troops the first favorable opportunity that offered. Tactics changed tremendously thanks to new inventions and ways of thinking. With the advantages of muskets came their disadvantages. The inaccuracy of these weapons caused the need to compensate by massive firepower and lines of columns of infantry, which would fire in sequence in a manner designed to keep as much musket balls going towards the enemy as possible. Proper marching even was crucial, so formation was maintained and nothing got in the way of the unit's orders. The marching and formations also had a psychological effect on the soldiers, and the feeling of belonging to a unit could do a great deal for soldiers' morale.
The political state of affairs in 18th century Europe was ideal for creating war. Rival nations were competing for territory, resources, and power, both in Europe and overseas. The War of Austrian Succession is an excellent example of 18th century politics leading to war. After the death of Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI in October of 1740, the succession to the throne by his daughter, Maria Theresa, was called into question. Salic law prevented royal inheritance by a woman, but prior to his death, Charles made an attempt to circumvent Salic law by persuading German states to agree to the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which would allow his daughter to inherit the Austrian Habsburg throne. King Frederick II of Prussia saw an opportunity to demonstrate his power and expand his territory, and on December 16, 1740, he challenged Maria Theresa by invading the Austrian province of Silesia, beginning the War of Austrian Succession. When Maria Theresa finally retaliated by invading Prussia in 1744, France, who was allied with Prussia, declared war on Austria. But when the French declared war on Austria, Britain, France's rival, entered the conflict and declared war on Prussia. After years of fighting, neither side could score a decisive blow against their opponents. So when the economic drain on resources became too great, the belligerents were forced to negotiate peace. And in October of 1748, the war came to an end with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. But this would prove to be temporary peace, as war would erupt in Europe just 8 years later. Due to animosity following the War of Austrian Succession, the European powers shifted their alliances. Prussia allied itself with Great Britain, and in response, Austria formed an alliance with France. And in 1756, after 2 years of fighting between the French and British, the French and Indian War in North America sparked the 7 Years' War. 10th, 1763, the Treaty of Habsburg settled affairs between Austria and Prussia, and the Treaty of Paris put an end to the fighting between the French and British. France, who gave up on North America late in the war to focus on fighting in Europe, was unable to maintain its territory in North America. Per the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained control of all of France's North American holdings. This era of warfare resulted in Britain's global dominance. The British Empire became the most prominent power in the world following the 7 Years' War, but it also led to revolution. The economic drain caused by the war forced the British to raise taxes in their colonies, which would eventually be the spark that starts the American Revolution.
We've seen extreme power changes, the forming of new countries, the invention and use of new technologies, and modern-day Western civilization take shape due to warfare. Were it not for the military's evolution and bloody wars, human advancement would not be where it is today.